Imagine a princess, the daughter of the most powerful king in Israel, living in the luxury of the royal palace. Now imagine this same young woman being betrayed by her own brother, left in disgrace and abandoned by the father who should protect her. This is the story of Tamar, King David's only mentioned daughter, a story that will shock you and leave you speechless. How could a royal family crumble so terribly? What can this ancient tragedy teach us about power, lust, and the devastating consequences of our choices? Get ready for an intense journey through the corridors of power and the dark corners of the human heart. Before we continue, don't forget to check if you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any more biblical stories that will challenge your understanding and touch your heart. And without further ado, let's go to the story. In the heart of Jerusalem, around the year 1000 before Christ, stood the majestic palace of King David. In this setting of opulence and power lived a complex and often troubled royal family. King David, the man after God's own heart, was father to many sons from different wives. Among them, Amnon, the firstborn, the heir apparent to the throne, known for his beauty and charisma, stood out. Absalom, another prominent son, was admired throughout Israel for his majestic appearance and long black hair. And then there was Tamar, David's only mentioned daughter, a young woman of rare beauty and grace. Her name, which means palm tree in Hebrew, evoked images of elegance and strength. Tamar grew up in the palace, learning the arts of royalty, her father's songs, and God's laws. The scriptures give us a glimpse of life in the palace in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. Now Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and Amnon, David's son, loved her. This brief mention sets off a chain of events that would shake the foundations of David's house. The family dynamics were already complicated due to David's multiple wives and children, but what was about to happen would take this complexity to a tragic level. It's important to note that in the culture of the time, marriages between half-siblings were not uncommon, especially among royalty. However, what would unfold would not be a marriage proposal, but an act of violence that would forever stain the reputation of the royal house. Imagine Tamar, a young princess full of hope and dreams, walking through the palace gardens, unaware of the danger that was approaching. She was probably thinking about her future, how she could serve God and her people, without imagining that her life was about to change drastically. Meanwhile, in the royal quarters, Amnon, consumed by an impure desire, was plotting a plan that would change the course of the royal family's history. The palace, which should be a place of safety and family love, was about to become the scene of a terrible tragedy. The sun rose over Jerusalem, its golden rays sliding over the stone walls of the royal palace. In Amnon's quarters, King David's firstborn, the light of day did not bring peace. The prince was tormented, consumed by a desire that was corroding him from within. 2 Samuel 13, verse 2 tells us, Amnon was so distressed that he became ill because of his love for Tamar, his sister, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for Amnon to do anything to her. Imagine Amnon, heir to the throne of Israel, tossing and turning in his bed, unable to sleep, his face pale and drawn. Concerned servants whispered through the corridors, speculating about the prince's mysterious affliction. What could be tormenting the son of the great King David? Beloved, before we continue with this shocking story of Amnon and Tamar, allow me to share something crucial with you. The complex family dynamics and the dangers of sin that we see in this story are not exclusive to biblical times. Today, more than ever, our families face similar challenges in a world that is increasingly hostile to faith. To help you protect your faith and your family in these difficult times, we have prepared the Christian Survival Manual. The link to download this essential guide is in the pinned comment below this video. But don't leave it for later because it won't be available for long. Download it right now in the pinned comment. Let's go back to our story and see what was tormenting Amnon. The answer was Tamar. Every time Amnon saw her in the palace corridors, his heart raced. The sound of her laughter echoing through the gardens made him feverish. The sparkle in her eyes, the waves of her black hair like night, everything about her fascinated him and tortured him at the same time. But this was not a pure and noble love. It was a distorted desire, an obsession that grew like a weed in his heart. Amnon knew it was wrong. Tamar was his half-sister, his father's daughter with another wife. Yet, he could not shake these thoughts away. In a culture where purity was highly valued, especially for women of royalty, Tamar was untouchable. Her virginity was not just a personal matter, but a matter of state. A strategic marriage could one day seal important alliances for the kingdom. Amnon found himself facing a moral dilemma. As David's son, he knew God's law. Leviticus 18 verse 9 was clear. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father or the daughter of your mother, whether born in the house or born outside. He knew that his feelings were forbidden, a violation of divine and human laws. However, desire is a powerful force, capable of blinding even the wisest. And Amnon was far from wise. He was young, impulsive, accustomed to having his whims fulfilled as crown prince. While Amnon consumed himself in his torment, life in the palace continued its normal course. Tamar, completely oblivious to the thoughts of her half-brother, continued her duties and studies, preparing for the role she would one day play as Princess of Israel. The tension grew day by day. Something had to give. And that's when Jonadab, Amnon's cousin, entered the scene. The scriptures describe him as a very shrewd man in 2 Samuel 13, verse 3. Jonadab noticed Amnon's affliction and decided to investigate. "Why are you, the king's son, so thin day after day? Won't you tell me?" Jonadab asked. And with these words, he opened the floodgates of a torrent that could no longer be contained. At this moment, dear viewer, pause and reflect. How many times have our own passions and desires blinded us to what is right? How can we distinguish between true love and destructive obsession? The story of Amnon serves as a warning about the dangers of nurturing forbidden desires. As the plot unfolds, we will see how a simple conversation between cousins will trigger a series of events that will forever change the course of the history of Israel. The palace, which should be a place of wisdom and justice, is about to become the scene of a heinous crime. Be prepared, because what comes next will shock you and demonstrate how even the most privileged can fall into the snares of sin when they stray from the ways of God. The air in Amnon's room was heavy, laden with the weight of a confession that had just been made. "I love Tamar, Absalom's sister, my brother." The words hung in the air, almost visible in their intensity. Jonadab, the cunning cousin, listened intently, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. Instead of advising Amnon to seek help, to pray, or to turn away from these sinful thoughts, Jonadab did something unthinkable. He devised a plan as wicked as it was ingenious, a plan that would take advantage of Tamar's kindness and innocence against her. "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be sick," Jonadab whispered, his voice low and conspiratorial. "When your father comes to visit you, tell him, I beg you, let my sister Tamar come and make me some food and prepare it in front of me so that I can see and eat from her hand." The plan was simple in its execution, but terrible in its intentions. Taking advantage of the customs of the time, where it was common for women in the family to care for the sick, Jonadab created a perfect trap, a trap that would use Tamar's compassion against her. Imagine the scene. Amnon lying in his bed, feigning an illness that did not exist. The great King David, concerned about his firstborn, entering the room with a troubled expression. And then, the seemingly innocent request, "Father, please ask Tamar to come take care of me." David, in his paternal concern, did not see beyond the surface of the request. How could he imagine that his own son was plotting something so horrible against his daughter? The king, who had once been able to defeat giants and lead armies, was blind to the danger lurking within his own home. As the plan unfolded, Tamar remained oblivious to the danger that was approaching. She was probably in her quarters, perhaps embroidering or studying the scriptures, when she received the call from her father. Imagine her heart filling with compassion upon hearing that her brother was sick and needed her care. What followed was a sequence of events that demonstrates how evil can disguise itself as kindness, how wickedness can hide behind a mask of fragility. Tamar, in her innocence and kindness, fell right into the trap set by her own brother. The scriptures tell us that Tamar went to her brother's house, who was lying down. She kneaded the flour, baked the cakes in his presence, and baked them. Then she took the baking pan and served him the cakes, but he would not eat. Then Amnon commanded everyone to leave. After everyone left, We can almost smell the freshly baked cakes filling the room, see the steam rising from the food prepared with such care. Tamar, focused on her task, unaware that every move she made was being watched with eyes full of impure desire. As the scene unfolds in Amnon's room, the tension rises. The plan is in motion, the trap is set. Tamar, in her kindness, is about to face the most terrible moment of her life. And we, observers of this ancient tragedy, are reminded of how sin can corrupt even the most sacred family ties. Prepare to witness how an act of supposed illness transforms into a demonstration of pure wickedness, and how the life of a young princess will be irrevocably altered in a matter of moments. Amnon's room, once filled with the inviting aroma of freshly baked cakes, was now charged with palpable tension. Tamar, still unaware of the impending danger, approached her brother's supposedly sick bed, offering the food she had prepared with such care. The scriptures tell us the crucial moment. Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the cakes and serve me here in my room." Tamar brought the cakes she had prepared to her brother's room. Imagine the shock and horror that must have crossed Tamar at that moment. The brother she came to help with compassion now revealed his true and terrible intentions. The room, which should have been a place of healing, had transformed into a cruel trap. Tamar, demonstrating remarkable composure in the face of such danger, tried to dissuade Amnon. Her words, recorded in 2 Samuel 13:12-13, are a moving testimony to her integrity and wisdom. "No, my brother, do not force me, for this is not done in Israel. Do not do this folly. Where would I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be like one of the fools of Israel." She appealed to God's law, to Amnon's sense of honor, even suggested the possibility of a legitimate marriage, all in a desperate attempt to avoid the evil she saw in her brother's eyes. But Amnon, blinded by desire and empowered by his position of power, did not heed Tamar's pleas. What followed was an act of brutal violence, a heinous crime that would forever stain David's house. The scriptures, in their characteristic conciseness, describe the terrible event, but he would not listen to her voice. Instead, being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. At this moment, dear friend, it is impossible not to feel a profound indignation and sadness. A young innocent woman, a princess of Israel, raped by her own brother within the royal palace. It is a shocking reminder of how sin can corrupt even those who should be models of virtue and righteousness. But Amnon's cruelty did not end with the act of violence. The scriptures tell us that immediately after the crime, his love turned to hatred. Then Amnon hated her with the greatest hatred, for his hatred for her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. Imagine Tamar's emotional state at that moment. Violated, rejected, shamefully expelled from the room by Amnon's orders. The princess, who had walked with dignity through the palace corridors hours before, now wandered in despair, her clothes torn, ashes on her head as a sign of deep mourning. As news of this terrible crime spreads through the palace, we will see how different characters respond. The reaction of King David, of Absalom, Tamar's brother, and of the royal court itself will give us valuable insights into the nature of justice, family, and power in ancient Israel. Be prepared, because what comes next will reveal how a single act of wickedness can trigger a chain of events that will shake an entire kingdom, leading to more violence, betrayal, and pain. The story of Tamar is far from over, and the repercussions of this heinous crime will echo for generations. David's palace, once filled with music and celebration, was now immersed in a heavy, oppressive silence. News of the terrible crime committed against Tamar spread quickly, like a silent poison penetrating every corner of the kingdom. The scriptures offer us a glimpse of the initial reaction. When King David heard all these things, he was very angry. We can imagine the face of the great king, who had once been radiant with joy when composing psalms, now contorted with anger and pain. The man who had faced giants and conquered nations now found himself powerless in the face of the tragedy that had befallen his own home. But what followed David's initial anger was even more shocking: silence. No action was taken against Amnon. No justice was sought for Tamar. The king, perhaps paralyzed by the magnitude of the crime or the complexity of punishing his firstborn, chose not to do anything. This deafening silence echoed through the palace corridors, amplifying Tamar's pain and sense of injustice. Imagine the young princess, confined in her shame and grief, waiting day after day for a word, an action, any sign that her father, the king, would do justice. But that word never came. Meanwhile, Absalom, Tamar's brother, watched everything with eyes full of cold, calculated rage. The scriptures tell us that Absalom, however, did not speak to Amnon, either good or bad, for he hated Amnon because he had forced Tamar, his sister. Absalom's silence was different from David's. It was a silence laden with promises of revenge, a silence that hid plans for retribution that would forever change the course of Israel's history. David's silence, though perhaps understandable from a human perspective, was a tragic failure in his leadership and his role as a father. He allowed evil to go unpunished, thus planting the seeds for future conflicts and tragedies. Meanwhile, Tamar lived in desolation in the house of Absalom, her brother. Imagine the torment of this young woman, whose life was irrevocably altered, living each day with the pain of not only the crime committed against her, but also the lack of justice and support from her own father. This deafening silence reminds us that sometimes what is not said or done can be as devastating as the cruelest words or the most violent actions. David's inaction allowed the wound in his family to fester, setting the stage for even more pain and conflict. As we move forward in the story, we will see how this silence will be broken in unexpected and violent ways. Time passed, but the wound in Absalom's heart did not heal. For 2 long years, he cultivated his rage in silence, meticulously planning his revenge against Amnon. The palace, once a symbol of power and glory, now seemed like a minefield of repressed emotions and unresolved tensions. The scriptures tell us that, after 2 full years, Absalom invited all the king's sons. At first glance, this invitation seemed like an innocent attempt to bring the royal family together. Sheep shearing was traditionally a time of celebration and abundance. But behind this facade of normalcy, Absalom was weaving a deadly web. David, perhaps sensing that something was not right, declined the invitation. But Absalom insisted, specifically asking that Amnon be sent if the king himself could not go. Imagine the tension at that moment. David, hesitant, probably sensing that something was wrong, but unable to deny his son's request without admitting the terrible truth that everyone pretended to ignore. The scriptures reveal Absalom's sinister plan. He commanded his men, "Listen, when Amnon is drunk with wine and I say, 'Kill Amnon,' you will kill him. Don't be afraid. I take responsibility. Be strong and courageous." So Absalom's men killed Amnon, obeying his orders. Then all the king's sons mounted their mules and fled. The scene that followed must have been chaotic and terrible. Imagine the festive banquet suddenly turning into a scene of horror, the sound of laughter and conversation giving way to screams of terror and confusion. Amnon, drunk and vulnerable, being attacked by Absalom's servants. The immediate reaction of the other princes was total panic. The scriptures tell us that all the king's sons got up and mounted their mules, and they fled. Imagine the scene, the princes of Israel, who should be examples of courage and leadership, fleeing in terror, fearing that they might be the next targets of Absalom's wrath. Meanwhile, at the palace in Jerusalem, the news arrived distorted and amplified by panic. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. We can imagine David's horror and pain as he heard these words, believing for a terrifying moment that all his children had been killed. Amnon's sin, David's silence, and now Absalom's revenge, each action feeding the next in a downward spiral of violence and pain. As the dust of this terrible act begins to settle, we will see how it will unleash a series of events that will shake the kingdom of Israel to its foundations. Absalom's revenge is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter of conflict and tragedy. After Amnon's murder, Absalom flees to Jeshur, where he remains in exile for 3 years. During this time, King David mourns the loss of both his sons, Amnon by death and Absalom by exile. Eventually, David begins to miss Absalom. Joab, realizing the king's feelings, devises a plan using a wise woman from Tekoa to convince David to allow Absalom's return. The plan is successful, and Absalom returns to Jerusalem. However, the reconciliation is incomplete. David allows Absalom to return to his own home, but he does not allow him to see the king's face. This situation creates tension in the palace and sets the stage for future conflicts. Tamar's story, though tragic, left a lasting legacy. Its impact extends far beyond the moment of her affliction, offering profound lessons and inspiration for generations. First, we must consider how Tamar's story broke the silence about abuse. In an era when such matters were often swept under the rug, the inclusion of this account in the scriptures is incredible in this regard. Tamar's legacy also manifests itself in how her story influenced subsequent events in David's house. Absalom's revenge and his eventual rebellion against David can be traced directly to this incident. This shows us how untreated sin can have far-reaching consequences, affecting families and even entire nations. Tamar's name was not forgotten. In fact, years later, Absalom named his own daughter Tamar, probably in honor of his sister. This act of remembrance shows us how Tamar's impact continued to resonate within her family. The lasting impact of Tamar's story shows us that no suffering is in vain when it allows others to find healing and justice. Her legacy continues to inspire and challenge, inviting us to be agents of change in our world. And so, beloved, we come to the end of this journey through Tamar's story. But remember, the true end depends on us. How will we apply these lessons to our lives? What difference will we make in our world? The temptations and dangers we saw in this biblical story did not remain in the past. They are more present than ever in our current world. So don't forget to click on the link that is in the comments and download your Christian Survival Manual. And if this video touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth explorations of the eternal truths contained in the scriptures. Until next time, and may God bless you.